One of the most anticipated new cartoons of 2021, The Ghost and Molly McGee is the last big series to come out of Disney Channel's increasingly illustrious animated pedigree. Opposites attract and hijinks ensue, but can this new show live up to the hype, or does it stand not even a ghost of a chance of pleasing Disney Channel diehards? This review has the answers. For all the ups and downs its live-action product has gone through, Disney Channel's relationship with animated fare has been inconsistent over much of the 2010s. After Phineas and Ferb morphed into a juggernaut and the aquatic slice-of-life episodic Fishhooks took a few laps around the filter, Disney mostly handed off cartoon duties to Disney XD, as they made a slight pivot around 2013 from Disney Channel's gender-bent clone, more or less, to something of an animation haven, though they still brought the heat in both mediums. Gravity Falls, the woodsy animated mystery that needs no introduction, set the stage for Disney Fare gaining a reputation for massive epics, one that would eventually be further burnished, for better or for worse, with Star vs. the Forces of Evil a few years later. Many underrated favorites would come from the peak, and ultimate twilight, of Disney XD, but it is hard to tell the story of the modern serialized cartoon without illustrating how Disney's efforts at helped shape it. With the engineered demise of Disney XD in 2017, the hobbled star would flame out on Disney Channel as it cleared the way for the chief present holders of the Disney animation mantle, Amphibia and the Owl House, both massive stories with gripping lore and even grippier hold on the kids' TV conversation. Oh, and Big City Greens also exists right now, but like its title family, it is a fish out of water, both as an unassuming episodic comedy among story-driven Goliaths, and in the fact that it was originally developed for Disney XD, but would be thrown to the main channel in keeping with the network's forcible shove into irrelevancy around the time it was set to premiere. With Amphibia and the Owl House both on their way to conclusions, the throne of great Disney Channel cartoons, now almost fully whitewashed into a tale of mostly great narrative triumphs, has been abdicated once more for a new generation of cartoons to rise to the occasion. And so, under this backdrop, enters The Ghost and Molly McGee. Created by Bill Motz and Bob Roth, longtime Disney employees, and originally passed on by Nickelodeon, The Ghost and Molly McGee tells the tale of the two title characters. The ghost, Scratch, who seems like they passed on the wrong side of the coffin and will make the world more miserable for it, who ends up getting tied to Molly, tween optimist bent on making the world a better place. The situational joining of two characters with mutually exclusive, at-odds objectives generates an unusual friendship through which hijinks ensue, and they both might learn a thing or two. Even beyond keeping up with the good work at Disney Channel, this show has a lot to live up to. Making these relatively straightforward character dynamics carry this cartoon will not be an easy task to execute. But it's already been renewed for a second season by Disney Channel, so we're pretty much stuck with it anyway for a while, no matter how it fares. Fitting, given the premise. But my expectations aren't as lofty as the ones elsewhere in the kids' TV space. I just want a good show first. So does The Ghost and Molly McGee manage that? A dive through the show's first episode should clear all doubts. The show's first half hour breaks format somewhat in order to offer a proper introduction to our unusual pair. In the realm of the ghosts, a ghostly tribunal is passing judgment on a crop of spooky haunters.
Just one last ghost to review.
Not here, must we?
The Ghost Council summons Scratch.
What? Hey!
Scratch has clearly been a thorn in their side for a while, but they can't argue with his results in the simultaneously ironically, fittingly, and conveniently named town of Brighton. But there's clearly a longing in his heart as he heads back to his space. As much as his simple hedonism has fulfilled him, the loneliness is nagging at him. Across town, enter the McGees. From the sounds of it, they've been through some things, and they've moved around a lot. They're hopeful that Brighton works out, but things might just get complicated as they move into the house Scratch has been haunting. We then focus on Molly for a few minutes as she asserts herself into the space, much to the chagrin of Scratch, who ends up cobbling together a hastily worded curse that ends up binding him to her in a massive backfire. Essentially, the only way for Scratch to be cut loose is if he spooks the McGees away for good. So he tries that, but Molly thwarts him by, weirdly, sticking up for Scratch as someone not to be afraid of. And through that, they're in it for the long haul. At least Scratch gets a miniature place to call his own, thanks to clever use of an international tradition which works perfectly and appropriately here. points to Disney here for thoughtful diversity rather than just shoehorning it in. In the show's first proper episode, First Day Frights, it's Molly's first day of the new school year. A fitting place for a kid's cartoon to start, and as I'll let Molly explain, first impressions are everything.
Today is the first day of school, and our family's moved a lot. You know, like a lot. So trust me when I tell you the first day of school in a new town is super important and the stakes have never been higher. Do you realize that even one eensy-weensy embarrassing mistake could turn me into a social outcast forever?
I mean, she has a point. And of course, if Molly's a social pariah, then the McGees would have to leave, right? So Scratch makes it his mission for school day sabotage. While Molly can handle his first curveball gracefully, it's not him who screws things up, as Molly herself shows us, in the immoral words of Tyler Perry and the shows he makes. I can do bad all by myself.
Andrea Davenport, social influencer, future disruptor. I'd be honored if you join me on stage this afternoon at the new school year assembly. Wow, thanks. That would be incredible, Andrea.
In Brighton, one does not simply mispronounce the name of Andrea Davenport, and it is cardinal sins like this that ruin a social existence. And it is also what tells me I will be an absolute fiend whenever I get around to checking out more teen dramas. I can imagine the juicy faux pas from here. But anyway, for Molly, not even a fitting musical montage is enough for the student body to give her the time of day, at least publicly. Scratch manages to add insult to her social injuries by inadvertently making Andrea faint and leading Molly right to the school assembly, and the entirety of the school sees Molly on stage with an unconscious Andrea. Were this freeform instead of Disney Channel, I'm pretty sure this would suggest murder. Molly's social fortunes sinking by the second, Scratch has a crisis of conscience and decides to not send her through a solitary existence. He possesses the young influencer and convinces the school to give Molly, and a previous victim of Andrea's young scorn, a second chance. From the jump, I wasn't really sold during this first pair of singles. While the introduction episode is well built and well paced, it only really leaves one episode, the second half, First Day Frights, to establish a judgment of their execution. The hits to Molly's optimism and legitimate self-doubt serve to root her character, but the back end, where Scratch gains something of a conscience and fixes things up, is, while necessary, a bit rushed and a bit of a letdown. The show's premise suggests that they're both going to grow out of their archetypes and into more emotionally developed characters, but Scratch breaking rank so sharply so soon feels cheap. I understand why they did it. They had maybe 2 minutes left to resolve the episode, and on episodic status quo rules, but it weakens the dynamic that this show went out of their way to spend an entire 11 minutes to establish if it's going to be considerably altered, if temporarily, the second it's put to the test. As much as it's not the greatest ending for Molly to lie in the bed she inadvertently made, how they executed this alternate conclusion feels like a cop-out. Thankfully, there's no glaring deficiencies or abject failures to complain about. The show is conceptually sound and well constructed from a story stance, but something in the second segment just failed to convince me the show could work. I was convinced enough, however, to give this show a second chance. Just like the first episode told me, with its second set of singles. In the first half of episode 2, Molly's on the hunt for a new human best friend, and she's cut down to 3 potential candidates, who are all going camping one Saturday night. Molly will use the experience to test the potential bonds, while Scratch is distracted with a tag-along who just can't seem to take a hint. After a relatively standard activities montage, one of the potential friends, Libby, also the former outcast from the previous episode, tells a scary ghost story about Howlin' Harriet, a myth that turns out to be real, and Molly takes it upon herself to send her on. Though not without a little help, and it turns out Libby is willing to go along with a situation like this. In the end, not only does Harriet gain what she needs to ambiguously pass on, but Molly gains a new friend, Libby, a reserved girl who's reluctant to open up, and in that way perhaps the polar opposite of Molly in a different way than Scratch is. I'll give credit where it's due here to the interaction between the ghost and human worlds that naturally comes out of a premise like this. The way they leaned into it is something that feels sort of obvious in hindsight, but was executed in a creative and unique way. And for those who want to read into it too much, it opens up questions as to whether there are multiple varieties of ghosts in this canon. The episode was also a solid and creative introduction to a few new characters, and succeeds fairly well in combination with the episode immediately previous to this one in introducing us to Libby, as it's clear she's going to be a frequent part of our cast, and possibly all of the girls we met in this half will be recurring characters to look out for. Similarly to the overall goals with Molly and Scratch to flesh them into more well-rounded characters through the show's execution, I wonder if Molly can also help Libby come out of her shell a little more and help her find her feet. She's only just been socially ostracized for 5 or 6 years after all. That does horrible things to a person. In the second segment of this episode, Brighton's softball team, like much of the town itself, is a disappointing letdown. But despite her lack of experience, Molly McGee is bent on turning Brighton into her very own field of dreams. If they believed in themselves, success would come. Unfortunately, it's a little more complicated than that, and like any sports team desperate to gain an edge and thinking no one's paying attention, they resort to cheating, thanks to an irked Scratch trying to show a thing or two to a rival player who taunted Molly. Cheating is against Molly's morals, however, and while she objects to taking part in the scheme, she keeps her head down in hopes that their success will inspire the team to believe in themselves. By the time the finals roll around, that doesn't pan out, but in the last moments of the game, we still get a heartwarming ending anyway, as Libby, the only person on the team who seems to care much for it, brings the trophy home. Sometimes cheaters do prosper. Just look at the 2000 presidential election or high-powered business people, for instance. This second segment plays with the concept of dubious morality really well. It's not something a lot of kids' TV decides to tackle, given they're concerned with setting an example for some of the youngest among their audiences, but they made going out on this limb work really well, especially in the context of what the show's overall story aims seem to be. Moral quandaries like this do happen in life, and sometimes there are no good answers. Approaching the messy uncertainties of the world and finding ways to get through things with dignity is something I think is important to show at least once in a venue like this. On technical grounds, there isn't really much to fault. The stories are creatively cohesive, the visuals are smooth and animate well, and the show's art style is refreshingly distinct, throwing in all sorts of textures and highlights that the art styles of many other shows would see as superfluous and unnecessary. The commitment to this visual splendor, particularly involving anything ghostly, helps to better sell the show from an execution standpoint, as it better illustrates what the story is trying to do. Brighton itself is run down and muted, Molly is bright and energetic, almost like Star Barfly without the magic. Disney Channel's really had a thing for that archetype, huh? Mabel, then Star, and now Molly. And Scratch's scares are as unnerving as you'd expect them to be. Speaking of the ghost world for a moment, upon thought, it's hard not to suggest that the system there is akin to the beloved Disney theatrical product Monsters, Inc. Between the council and scare quotas and performance reviews, the rest of the world building obviously isn't there because that's not the focus of this show, but it's hard to deny that that's basically the crux of the concept, and that's an interesting observation to say the least. The Ghost and Molly McGee occupies a deeply complicated space on the kids' TV map right now. As a series, it shows sparks of creativity, clever concepts, and gold standard world building and plot construction. But for whatever reason, this cartoon doesn't seem to do any of that in a way that's all that compelling to keep up with. It's conceptually promising and structurally sound, but as I excoriated Cartoon Network over with the Fungies last year, competency alone, even if it isn't as basic here, isn't enough to warrant a recommendation of this show as good. It's on the right side of average, lucky for it, but for me, I don't feel terribly convinced by what I've seen of this. Beyond its own challenges, however, the Ghost and Molly McGee faces a troubling quandary in the context of Disney Channel's current output. I guess if this is where this show is starting, then I can't wait for this show to become a sprawling, lore-riddled mess in Season 2. Maybe Molly has to enter the ghost world, or save the ghost and human world from caving in on themselves, or help Scratch keep his job or whatever. I'm being hyperbolic here, but it's hard not to ask such a question when a number of Disney Channel's more popular shows of the 2010s, Gravity Falls, Star vs., and Amphibia, and The Owl House, are serialized, story-heavy epics that have become magnets for anyone who's a sucker for lore and, dare I say it, for a certain type of viewer who may consider themselves above the whims of a typical out-of-demographic kids' TV viewer. Serialized audiences have driven much of the modern kids' TV zeitgeist and discourse, and it's fully plausible that that influential base may shun this show, not on its own merits as a cartoon, but rather on the fact that it doesn't have an overarching narrative, and is thus unworthy for them to invest in. As much as Disney has given us Gravity Falls and Star vs. and Amphibia, they've also given us Randy Cunningham and the 7D and Future Worm, And those are great cartoons in their own right as well, but again, by this point, here in 2021, the recent history of the animated adventures of Disney Channel, and now that Disney XD, where all the shows I just mentioned are from, has fallen, Disney the producer as a whole, has been whitewashed into a bastion for great story-driven epics. And not only is that sort of a narrative false, it's also damaging for when Disney doesn't make that kind of a show, as they appear to have here, and a subset of the audience pans it for not matching their own self-imposed expectations to see another serialized affair. Even setting aside the kids' TV community's ignorance of live-action programming, episodic cartoons across kids' TV have been given the short end of the stick in recent years, with the community at large only really seeming to pay attention to a handful of episodics which have managed to develop their own distinct subcultures, ones that have built enough controversy to keep themselves in the headlines on that attention alone, or more infallibly, only after elements of story or continuity are established in a cartoon seasons later, at which point the damage from the initial ignorance has been done in one way or another. Surprisingly, this mentality has sustained itself, despite occasions when a story-driven show has been hurt by poor storytelling. Most notably in the later seasons of Star vs. the Forces of Evil, and even with the controversy surrounding some of the narrative decisions made by the Netflix series Voltron Legendary Defender. The less said about that show, the better. Even more surprisingly, many of the people who are at fault for shunning episodic cartoons pride themselves on being fervent fans of animation as a medium, purportedly caring for it in all its forms, yet hypocritically showing their true colors through their apparent blind ignorance and indifference to episodic animated programming as a whole. It's worth questioning whether some parts of the kids' TV and animation communities are developing a downright exclusionary mentality to episodic programming in general. Something that, were it happening, would prove downright dangerous to both the kids' TV community and its discourse, and to the kids' TV channels and producers themselves, whom, while none of this is coming from the target demographic, these viewership choices still impact. I may not personally be a fanatic over the Ghost and Molly McGee, and you might not be either, and that's completely fair. But if you do decide to go and watch it, I ask that you make that judgment based on your perception of the show's merits, and not for the simple fact that it's an episodic show premiering off the backs of two popular serialized cartoons. If this show truly isn't interesting enough to continue after it finishes its current 2 seasons, then perhaps it can stand in the annals as a martyr, a canary in the coal mine to consider paying attention to cartoons both episodic and story-driven alike. If this video was up your alley, then hit subscribe for all the latest in the world of television. And if you really want to support my content, you can get exclusive bonuses for as little as $3 a month at benj.tk/join. On the topic of Disney Channel's other recent fare, you can check out this apparently prescient commentary about the fates of Amphibia and the Owl House, as well as reviews of more of the latest kids' TV series, up here or down the description. I'm Benzie Johnson Jr., I'm enthusiastic about television, and I'll see you next time.